And now we will, as this morning we were talking about low code, we will have a talk about low code API DevOps approach to API lifecycle management with Darshan, founder and CTO at Itorix, and also with Rakshith, the CTO at Itorix, who will join us. Hello, Rakshith. How are you?
Hi, Mehdi. Thank you very much. It looks like Darshan is under the weather and he could not join today, but I'll make sure to cover the full breadth today.
That's perfect. Your talk was one of the most appreciated in our last conference, so we're glad to have you again. Are you able to share your slide?
Yes, great.
Yeah, perfect. The stage is yours for 20 minutes. Thank you very much, Rakshit.
Thank you, Mehdi. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. Today, we'll spend some time on trying to take a look at how a low-code approach to solving some of the API lifecycle, streamlining some of the high-impact API programs is what we'll spend some time on today. Being at an API Days, this slide is kind of a misnomer, but I thought it would be a good one to start with, where we're not talking about APIs and its importance, but take a leaf of the history and try to spend some time on trying to look at how things have been changed over the last 15, 20 years. And this is taking an example of if you've been used to buying music and music as albums, and I'm not sure how many of you have been used to it, but if you are grown up in that age, you essentially have been with buying albums, even if you like the single song, you essentially spend in trying to buy the whole album. And it was because that was how the whole service was actually offered. Then came a wave where Netflix and others radically simplified, where they brought in the ability for consumers to really pick and choose and get the best of everything under the sun, where it was purely subscription based and it was more personalized by nature. This ability to unbundle the whole music from an album to primarily making it available as on demand based on consumption radically simplified and created new business models. While it's just one simple example, and if you pick and choose, there are many more like this which has happened over the years. The bedrock for a lot of this to really happen was the APIs, which essentially changed the way in which they just purely enabled access to services, to essentially creating new experiences and new business models. And which is what, if you look at all the numbers, while they are staggering, the most important ones obviously are where come in the next couple of years, you obviously are going to see majority of these services are going to be API driven. And given the kind of importance that APIs now have in the current business construct, the importance has actually grown even deeper, where the amount of services being done is growing by the day. And which is where the next wave of where enterprises are making sure that there is some method to the madness where they can actually make sure that the investments are really yielding benefits to the top line or bottom line of their business. Given the way the API programs have been scaling, if you really think about it, the number of people involved is actually growing as well. What was initially thought about as let's create a center of excellence within an enterprise slowly transpired into such a way that this needs to be owned by the business, the BUs, the LOBs, and which is where people start thinking about from going from a simple project to a platform to a program based approaches, where they start seeing that it cannot be a small project done by a small set of people or within a small group of teams as a program. It needs to be a platform that needs to be done across the enterprise. But given the kind of actors that are involved in this API lifecycle, whether it's a development team, the analyst, the operations team, the business team who are actually setting the experiences and the requirements, there comes a point where you start realizing that they are all operating on a small slice of information across the API lifecycle, which is where it starts getting to a point where you start seeing where the expectation of what you embarked on to what you finally got delivered is a complete mismatch. And You want to blame it on automation, or you can blame it on the number of technologies and tool stack that people have today, or the complexity, or anything else. The bottom line is it affects reliability and predictability in business. While the intentions are right to get things into production a lot quicker and faster, there is no way in which people are able to make those changes. While there are a top cream of enterprises who are by default digital natives, who are essentially making hundreds of releases every day, and making sure they can actually experiment, see the impact, take those and make a data-driven decision in terms of changing based on what they get back, while others are struggling with even getting a couple of releases done in a month. So which is where you start seeing the difference and the gap from what it was expected to what is finally happening. And if you double click on this and say, okay, why is this really happening? We start realizing that there is huge amounts of time being spent on making sure that people can get something into production and make it really work without having hiccups. There is insane amount of time being spent on making sure they can actually make it work even if it's pushed into production, because there are guardrails which doesn't make sure that things don't go haywire. There is a lot of things that are done handcrafted by people trying to stitch things together, either homegrown or open source, stuff like this, which essentially makes this overall part of automation a lot harder to come by. While you really want to make sure that you are doing something which is quite effective, the ability to make sure that what you initially anticipated to what you can get into production at every stage, whether it's a design or implementation or even post production, you're struggling with having the right levels of checks and balance. And given a choice, a lot of the API team would prefer to work off a single pane of glass, which is where you start seeing the big shift from having things broken with each of them having their own streams of work, would rather be more simplified with ability to come together, where it's a more simplified, it's automated by nature, and they're working off a single pane of glass, because the ability for getting things into customers' hands, ability to launch something a lot quicker and faster, ability for the feedback that they can get drives the overall API program and the momentum. More so than ever, it also gives an opportunity to see, experiment, and play around in the ecosystem by coordinating and working with the wider ecosystem. Take an example of the Spotify itself. Spotify itself is great, but how do you make sure it's seamless? Telco operator billing, making sure it's embedded with every operator possible, which makes it built to within their own existing plans that they already have. Radically simplifies the onboarding effort, because you're going after a market segment which is quite easy to onboard, but the experience is still delivered by them, but you're simplifying and getting them onboarded a lot quicker and faster. And if business wants to monetize these through APIs, there needs to be an ability where they can actually stand behind and say that the services work. There is a level of stability and reusability, so that they don't go actually redoing this for every project or every program. So a platform-based approach essentially tries to solve a major chunk of trying to do this from what it was to what it needs to be. This is where, uh, given the last decade plus experience that we have been seeing, the fundamental shift from trying to take an approach where if you're trying to do services and APIs and you're building them, why should this be always specific to a small niche group of people within an enterprise? What is stopping from a business team from actually going about and having anybody be able to design an API, or anybody to be able to say, we have a new idea, can we actually do an AB based deployment and test it out with a smaller group of people? And it should not be having a long thought process, which includes 3 6 months of planning from initially from a conceptualization to getting something into production or testing things out, which is where the ability to leverage the existing skill set and people within an organization and democratizing it in such a way that anybody and everybody can be part of an API program is the first major shift that is we are seeing required for enterprises to scale and meet the future growth challenges that they'll start getting into. Second is the ability to try and make sure that the overall process is made seamless and blended behind the scene in such a way that what's pretty much obvious need not be something that needs to be done over and over again. Whether it is the simple checklist or taking something into production and notifying people based on what's being pushed out, or even from thinking standpoint of, hey, here is a new set of services and that can be leveraged by every part of the organization, needs to be made available in such a way that people can discover, adopt, and use and build on top. Essentially, creating those Lego blocks becomes very important. Last but not the least, which is the complex rate at which modernization is really happening and the technological changes that we are seeing, there needs to be a balance between having to learn a lot of new technology every time for developers or people part of the API team to respond back to utilizing these new technology and skill set. You can take a simple example of an API gateway or a service mesh. While they may be very rudimentary as an example, but if you really think about it, everybody is going on the cloud and they're leveraging the technology stack that's pretty much available there. If it's going to be a polyglot deployment for quite some time to come, how can they make sure that it's easily serviceable with what they have and not having to rebuild those services for every target deployment they finally end up with? Which is where, irrespective of the gateway provider or the service mesh provider that they pick and choose, the team does not need to learn new technology. So it needs to be completely decoupled. So these three fundamental aspects of what we are seeing becomes very important for a lot of the enterprises to scale big time going forward. But if you want to double click this low code approach, while the approach is great, but from if you want to break it apart from an API lifecycle, what does this entitle, right? So if you think about within the initial phase of plan and design, the ability for having to work with something which is designed first is fundamentally known to everybody. But how easily it is done is something that we are seeing as a big technology gap. And which is where we see the ability for having to get the services up and running a lot quicker and faster becomes a paramount importance for enterprises. And having an ability to now incorporate this design first approach in such a way that every part of the API team can participate without having to know how to build, manage, or service the APIs becomes very important. And the other thing that we are seeing more frequently is the ability for discovery of the services within an enterprise, especially with the sprawl of services that we are seeing more frequently nowadays. It becomes even more important for these services to be discovered in such a way that people can actually build on top of what they already have rather than having to build everything from scratch, which is where we are seeing the ability to make sure that keeping people updated, keeping people covered of the new changes that's been brought in becomes very, very important. Next, as part of the phase where you're essentially trying to build this services out specifically for the platform that it's actually going to be running on, it becomes of even more importance because every time you make a change or every time you bring in new technology or new deployments of where it's going to finally run on or the provider that you pick and choose, it actually becomes a friction point for the technology team to adopt them. So which is where, from a business standpoint, if you're really looking at trying to get the momentum that you really need, it is even more important to make sure that it is being done in such a way that there is no vendor lock-in. The ability to abstract out, depending on where it's going to be finally running on, becomes super important. And while you're doing this, you're also trying to figure out whether the design principles on which it's finally being founded on, is it something of business value? Can you get immediate feedback? The ability to simulate these business conditions and get people to actually is even more important. What we are seeing also is as you start treading towards getting things done and pushing things into production, you're really figuring out what are the gated processes through which people can achieve this without having to break their head. Because the moment you have the automation being done by a handful set of team, then it is a crutch on which the enterprise is completely running on, which is where it becomes super important to take the crutch out and make this so seamless so that anybody within the organization has the ability to push something from a design to into production without having to go through a lot of process. But behind the scene, it takes care of making sure that it has got the right set of best practices, the security, the governance that is required for it to make sure that it's actually predictable and reliable when it's actually in production. The other pieces that we see is, while it's great, we going back to some of the previous conversations that we have been seeing on the specific track, we have seen the ecosystem where it's not just being self-controlled by the enterprise within by the developers built for their own consumers anymore. For the ecosystem to really flourish, you need to have a mechanism where the services are made available in a controlled fashion through a closed partner ecosystem or an open API based ecosystem, and the ability for people to actually get access to that and be able to use them without a lot of friction. What do we mean by a lot of friction? Because the ease at which people can actually consume those services sets the pace for the success of the APIs itself. So, which means whether it's being built for internal APIs or for an external API or for a partner ecosystem, you need to be able to have an ability to engage and get services into people's hand and make them readily usable while making it seamless by providing the user guides, the ability for them to have the test ground and sandbox, and even required is where you can actually bring in services from other people's, other enterprises, and create a market space of your own. While there is no one silver bullet that works, there is the necessity for having the flexibility for you to be able to experiment with what works for an enterprise. What would work for Amazon would not work for Walmart, and what would work for a large digital bank would not work for a neobank, because the business constructs are different. The kinds of challenges and the kind of pace at which they operate is quite different, which is where it becomes super important to be able to now have the ability to monitor, get a feedback, make it more data driven by nature, so that you can make quick decisions in fine tuning and changing course as and when required, so that you can iterate on the business models on which you're building on. So for doing this, you essentially are trying to figure out, is this something that requires a 500-member team with 6-9 months from inception to production? Or you think about having this in a way where you can actually get these things done in a matter of few hours to few days, make it more data driven by nature, get the feedback, iterate on top, and see if it's actually serving the purpose it was actually built out for. Which is where we start seeing that the first and foremost for making a low-code approach is to make sure that you have the capability to maximize the developer productivity so that you can take something from inception to something in production a lot quicker and faster. And more so than ever, you need to be able to get these things done without having to have a lot of people getting involved or becoming a golden handcuff in slowing the whole process. Second thing that becomes important is for the business to get involved in such a way that they can now maximize and iterate in such a way that this does not come at a cost where it actually breaks the bank, because you need to be able to have a complete view of the footprint of the various pieces of the API lifecycle done and have a visibility to say what's where and how it's actually working, who has access to what, and can the business get involved in such a way that they can drive some of the pieces from taking the initial conception to something into production. And that's where we see the low-code approach really solving some of these problems, whether it is north-south or east-west services within an enterprise that can drive the innovation, bringing in more stability and driving an API strategy that helps deliver more revenue to the enterprise. And I'm happy to now take more questions if there are any. Maybe
Yeah. Hello, Rakshith. We had some issue with connections, but we have 2 minutes for question. So we have one question about this low code aspect. So low code for business, like to mix APIs together, is quite popular now. You really think that we're able to do it also for the internal DevOps aspect?
it is possible, and which is where API Wiz as a company has radically tried to simplify this whole process. And given the last decade of experience that we have seen working with large enterprises, big and small, we have codified this into a platform that can actually help business now be equal stakeholder rather than APIs being seen as an IT aspect or a technology aspect, maybe.
Yeah. And what is the reception so far? Are business manager or non-technical managers able to take on this new practice?
I think so. Where it's now getting into that we are seeing is a shared ownership, because a lot of the times it's always been more of business trying to set the requirements and setting what's the things that they were focusing on. But obviously, they're only kept in dark and only come in towards the fag end of the overall API lifecycle where, hey, we have something now in production. We want you to primarily see if you can actually monetize this. But rather than that, becomes a co-shared ownership now where they get involved from beginning, and whether success or failure, they're now equally part of this. But the biggest advantages that we are seeing, and having worked with one of the large neobanks here in Asia Pacific, we've seen this really radically simplify where business is now getting completely involved in driving some of these initiatives and saying, hey, it's not just purely developing APIs for our own applications in the banking services. Let's look at how we can quickly partner. Can I work with you to now take some of the services and provide it to a telco provider? Can we do buy now, pay later kind of a service, which can now easily simplify and provide new service offerings, which brings in a revenue stream which we never had before. So we are seeing business now really lean forward and taking a stake at trying to solve this piece, maybe.
Yeah, perfect, Rakshith. Thank you very much for being with us. Yes, we were glad to.